Okay, well, welcome everybody. Unfortunately, the gentleman from Guilt was not able to make it. And so I stepped in and said, well, if you want a basic Angular talk, since AngularJS, and I know this from personal experience, AngularJS is an extremely popular JavaScript front-end framework right now. And I know we had a case study, and my thought was, well, we might also want to just have a just getting started in Angular, kind of demystify the terms, get you to kick the tires right away and become productive in AngularJS. It is that easy to work with, especially, how many of you here are Java EE programmers? Show of hands. Of that group, well, of any of you, how many of you are Spring developers? Okay, here's good news. If you've done Java EE 6 or 5 with add-inject, or if you've done Spring with auto-wired or beans, a lot of the ways that Angular works will be a little familiar on that already right out of the box. It does use some features we're used to. Also, and I don't get into it, we only have 45 minutes here, so it's not realistic for me to get into everything I want to cover. I teach a 2-day class on this, and it goes into all these things in detail with labs. And there's just not enough time in 45 minutes to cover testing. But it's extremely easy to test an Angular application. You know, if you usually do things like JUnit, you'd feel right at home with Jasmine after a couple of hours of playing. It would start clicking and making sense right away. So the good news is, from all the JavaScript frameworks you might have worked with in the past, Angular is probably the most approachable one for non-JavaScript developers. That's the statement I'll make. My name is Ken Rimple. I work for Chariot Solutions. I've been there for over 7 years now. I came to Chariot with the goal of starting up a training practice, and so that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years. I do some consulting. I do podcasts and screencasts. I'm responsible for the AV here at Chariot, and it's something I came up with a couple years back, as well as our TechCast and Dev News podcasts. And I do a lot of blogging and technical talks. So that's my background. My original background years ago was PowerBuilder, if you want to really know, but it was Java since Java 1.0.2. I did a lot of Java in your typical Java EE servlet world, WebLogic years ago up to Spring, and then started getting into other technologies as well. Got into JavaScript because I was working on a book on Spring Roo, which was a framework on top of Spring for quickly building applications. And I cratered in a chapter called JavaScript because they included a library called Dojo. And Dojo as a library was literally unscrutable for a person who hadn't worked with it before. It was very difficult to get to work. If it blew up, it didn't tell you why it blew up. And so I started looking around saying, well, what are my other options for hooking things into Spring? And after I published the book, I ran into Angular and really liked it. So, and it just connected right away. And apparently I wasn't the only one. So AngularJS is, and I put a couple quotes together. I'll start from the bottom up. The first statement you'll hear is code in my HTML. If you've ever looked at an AngularJS view or page, you'll see lots of tags. So one thing that some people are put off by right away with Angular is there's a lot of tags that you design or attributes on tags that you put out on your pages to make them do things. But that is part of it. The view side of the language is tag and attribute and style driven. And so they separate the code for the kind of what you would call custom tags out, and they're called directives. Also, you might hear this term JavaScript MVVM framework, and it's usually by someone going, well, this is an MVVM, and you just have MVC, and what are you talking about? So I'll talk about what MVVM is in a minute, but it's basically MVC. So it's a model view controller framework for JavaScript that uses dependency injection and HTML-based markup to develop applications. So, and I mentioned a little of this before, why Angular? Well, first of all, it uses dependency injection. Therefore, if I can inject things like services into my controllers, I can inject a fake version for testing purposes and say, whenever I call this save customer method, here's my fake version. It's going to say, yep, it worked. Or in this case, nope, it didn't. It's going to throw this error. So I can test how my controller operates in isolation. So we have that separation of concerns. There is a large community of AngularJS developers out there. If you go to the AngularJS Google group, how many people have visited that group? Okay, if you haven't, go there. Because a lot of since they're Google funded them. Google has a full-time project manager, Brad Green, who part of his job is to manage the AngularJS team. And they've got like 7 or 8 developers, I think most of which are Google employees. And so they're funding this effort. And so since they're funding it, Google+, right? So Google+ is one place to go. There's an IRC chat forum that's very popular on Freenode. #AngularJS is the name. And there are a large number of third-party modules out there that are just ready to use and add to your application. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to hack. And go to that Chariot Solutions page. So it's chariotsolutions.com, chariotsolutions.com/Angular ETE. And if you want to just watch, you don't have to do this, but if you want to follow along locally, you could take a look at these things, hack around a little bit, and then join back where I am. So we're going to scroll down to this list and pick the CodePen page, part 1. All right, so let me explain what you see here. CodePen is like a little JavaScript development tool. I'm sorry, CodePen is a JavaScript development tool for the browser. And there's a bunch of these out there. There's Plunker, there's this one, there's a couple of others. And they're really useful for sharing code snippets from developer to developer. You know, oftentimes you'll try to fix a bug and you won't know whether it's your code or whether it's isolated. So the quick way to do that in most of these things, you'll hear someone say, send me a Plunker or send me a CodePen. And they really mean just go in and build the thing completely in isolation. Here's my feature outside of my application. But you can also use it to build applications. And so what I have here is I have a really simple, believe it or not, page. Let me just make the font larger here. 70% of that script tag is a CDN URL, which points to just angularjs.com. So I have a page that has a script on it, laser pointer, a page with a script on it. Turn it on, Ken. Turn it on. There we go. AngularJS is on it. And then I'm also using Bootstrap, so I don't look like a complete neophyte when it comes to HTML. So the style sheet is the Bootstrap style sheet. And so then inside of this page, I've got a body tag. And in the body tag, I define 2 attributes. And I'm going to jump I'm not going to start pedantically and just talk about module and then controller. I'm going to kind of put a few things together. So the first thing you need to do is on your page somewhere, in some tag, you need to define what the application scope is physically on the page. Well, body is pretty much the whole page. So I'm just saying, you know what? The whole page is controlled by Angular. And that attribute is called ng-app. Now, ng stands for Angular. And so anything starting with ng is one of their built-in directives or directives from their libraries. If you write your own, pick your own prefix. So ng-app means it's the Angular application. And in our case, we've named it, and I'll show you how to create an app and name it in a second. We've named it My App. Once you do that, you can start playing around with expressions on a page. Now, I've gone one step further and I've added a controller, but I'm going to skip that controller for discussion purposes and just show you what this ng-app does for you. Okay, so don't make it larger and smaller. There we go. Okay, so if I, somewhere on this page, if I just put like 2 braces, I'm going to zoom into this. If I put 2 curly braces in, that is the template expression language in Angular. At this point, it will evaluate anything you give it and output the result, as long as Angular is running on your page. So I can say, for example, did you know that 3 + 4 = 7? String concatenation, real simple. And if Angular is properly booted, you can see that it's actually concatenating the strings together, and now something is working. Completely useless framework at this point, right? What am I going to do with that? But the idea is that you'll use something else to set up this area that we're evaluating. So the first term I'm going to give you is scope. By doing this ng-app, we've created a scope on the page, an area in memory that is attached to that application. So now I can, put something in here, manipulate it. Now, in most cases, what you'll do is instead of just purely using ng-app, you've got, more than one view, more than one thing you want to do on a page. you'll set up something called a controller. And so I've done that for you. And in this case, my controller has something called a message. So unless I goof this up, if I do brace, brace, message, brace, brace, it says, oh, well, whatever's in message on my view in the scope, show it. So the first thing is you define a scope somehow. I'll show you how to set that up. And you put things in the scope. All right. So the scope in Angular is the central topic for the MVC framework. It's the view model. So when you see model view, view model, MVVM, that means it's got a model, it's got a view, and a controller in dots there. And then a VM, a view model. In other words, a firewall that says only the stuff I put in scope is usable by the view. And only the functions I put in the scope can be acted upon from the view, and so on and so forth. So we'll set up this scope and we'll put things in it. But that's literally how easy it is to start using Angular. Now, I haven't shown you the JavaScript yet. Let me show you the little bit of JavaScript we have here. And it looks ugly, right, at first, because you're like, well, all these parentheses. But that's just JavaScript. Welcome to JavaScript, lots of semicolons and parentheses and things like that. My first warning to any of you, if you start working in JavaScript, use a linter tool like JSLint or JSHint every time you save your code. Because because there's no compiler in JavaScript. The only compiler is the interpreter on the browser. In Java and whatever else you use, you generally have a compiler and it says, oh, hey, dummy, you forgot a semicolon. I'm a dummy, I forget lots of semicolons. So if you run the linter, I have one set up for Vim, you know. If I save it, it immediately puts a little red line up and says, nope, you forgot a semicolon here. And saves you literally hours of where the heck did my code fail. So JSHint is my favorite. JSLint is a backup. And you can find, you know, integration for that in WebStorm or any IDE you might use. So the first thing we do is we define something called a module. That's that ng-app. So ng-app points to a module. A module is just a heap of stuff that I define. It's controllers, services, other things I can create, directives, can all be stored within a module. Okay, so Angular.module, and this is the creation syntax right here. Name, and I know it sounds redundant because I don't have any, but dependencies. That form of the module function with 2 parameters is the only form that creates a module. And if you have no dependencies, it's just an empty array. So at this point, Angular will have created a module, and it returns the module reference, so I can then call something else on it if I want to kind of chain setup methods together. So I create my module, my app. I can then refer to it as ng-app equals my app. And then below that, I say, oh, let's create a controller, .controller. And then we start into the weird Angular syntax, and I'll take some time on this now. So most of these things in Angular take a function, okay, and they take a naming thing before it. So I name it, and then I provide a function to define it. In the slides, I think I call it, you know, create a thingy, right? So module.thingy, name, comma, function. That's pretty much the style in Angular. So we create our main controller, and our main controller is defined by this function. And right here we have dependency injection. We are telling Angular to go find something called scope and give it to us, so that anything inside this function can use it. So controllers are used to set up the scope that they're assigned to. They're functions, they run all the way to completion, and then they die. They're history. But what they leave behind is their after image or the scope. So for example, you know, you want to load your customer list, and you want to set up an event to add a new customer to the list, or update the customers and save them to the database, or delete a customer. You could set those as functions on the scope, right, in this controller. So I can say $scope.something equals function, and I can make it do something. And I can load data, and so the data can be acted on. So I'm going to play a little bit with this and show you how this works, because this is enough for us to be dangerous. You'll notice this main controller will match the HTML for ng controller. So now, whenever you open that page up that has this app on it, it will take the body tag, it will load the app definition into memory. It will then say, oh, you want me to use main controller? I will run the function associated with main controller and set up the scope for that tag on down. So anything I've defined, like message, right? Go here to that message thing. Figures I would do this to myself. Hold on. Looks like this is going further than it needs to. That's better. So I've got this scope.message. Well, right there, that is whatever I can access in that main controller is visible to the body on down. That's all it is. Let's have it do something. Let's say scope.yell. Right? And by the way, that's not even correct syntax. Has to be a real function, doesn't it? There we go. And I'll do an alert. Let's be really obnoxious and do an alert. So scope.yell is a function that gets triggered by clicking on something. I'll have to show you how to click it. We'll do that in a second. But that's adding behavior to our controller. Okay. So far, so good. And now I'm just playing with my screen resolution here until I can actually show you and see at the same time. So now we're going to put a little button on here. Button ng click equals yell. So we see another thing that starts with ng. It's another attribute on a tag. These are called directives. The ng app, ng controller, and ng click are all directives. A directive is something that is defined by its name, and that name then basically defines an object that tells it how to manipulate the HTML by running an event, by changing the HTML DOM, and basically you can write your own. And that's half of writing an Angular application is building directives to serve your purposes. But at this point, I've just said go ahead and yell whenever you click. So whenever I click, right. That's a really exciting demo. I'm very proud of it. So anyway, point being, that's how easy it is to start setting up behavior. Let's look at a few more directives as we're in here. So we'll get rid of this silly junk. Oops, don't you dare. All right, let's put a form in here. Or at least a field. You know, I'll do a simple field. So check this out. This is something that usually wows people with Angular. Input ng model equals name, and then a paragraph, hello, name. This is your typical demo you'll see people do in Angular to say, check out how cool Angular is. Two-way data binding. Now, did anyone here ever use Flex? A few of you? Remember the whole two-way data binding thing in Flex? A lot of Flex developers are now Angular developers. It follows because it's one of the frameworks that does almost exactly the same thing. What's that? Oh, that would help, wouldn't it? Absolutely. I love pair programming with a large group. So, believe me, I do the same thing. And I do that myself all the time because I'm the teacher and I usually pick on others. So here we go. So now as I'm typing, I've got both an input tag. I almost did that last year. An input tag with the model name in it, and an expression with that same name in braces. And whenever I change the input, it changes the data on the expression. Now, if you can't see that, that's brace, brace, name, brace, brace. They took a very useful color of very light gray to show that. Right? Let me see if I can highlight it. No, not at all. So hello, brace, brace, name. And so that's two-way data binding. I can do the same thing with two input fields, too. It seems redundant. It is, but for example, right? Now all of a sudden two fields should show up. Whatever I type in one goes in the other. So a lot of Flex developers like Angular because it does the same thing with data binding. And it does it by using a directive called ng model, which is a lot more sophisticated than that little attribute shows. It has its own two-way data binding system built into it. It's got a controller built into it. And you can build your own input objects and controls. by extending that ng model concept. So what if we then decide, and by the way, this name, just quickly, that's in scope now. So there's a scope variable called name. Right? So if I, for example, go back to that JavaScript again, that is not JavaScript, Ken, try again. If I go back to the JavaScript, it's just sad, isn't it? Yeah. Watch him twist. And if I now do, instead of alert, name, scope.name, $scope.name. So whatever I put in that ng model as name, I can get on the outside. Since I've injected scope, I can access anything in the scope by pulling it in. Now, I could also just said name in here, right, and passed it in the function. But I can also say grab it out of the scope, what's the value? Scope's like a big object or map that I put things into and pull things out of, just like the model map in Spring MVC, for example. Very much the same concept. So if I did this again, I went back here, type. Of course, I have no way to trigger it, do I? Might help to have a button. Put the button back. ng click equals yell. Yell. So easy enough to kind of work back and forth. The third thing you'll do, so you'll set up data, you'll set up functions. And the third thing you might do is set up some sort of event. And so all scopes can listen for events. And you can broadcast events downward from the top of the app down to the controllers and down below for each of the scopes. And you can send them an event like, hey, guess what? Customer got saved. And you might turn a red to a green, hey. So you could do things like that with it and kind of communicate. It's like an event bus built into Angular. On scope, there's a $broadcast function and a $on function to accept a result. And to send up the stack, there's an emit function too. So there's all these nice little functions. Take a look at the scope object in the Angular documentation. You'll learn a lot. Okay. So how many slides did I kill just now? Okay, so expressions. I want to do one more thing with expressions. If I would have said impressions, I'd do something really silly, but I'm not going to do that here. So for example, maybe what I want to do next is I want to, where did it go? I want to demo, hold on. Let's do some conditionals and some lists. Just kind of round out our discussion on the scope. So the first thing I'll do is I'll set up a numbers array. Just a plain old array of numbers. And I'll show you another tag or attribute, another directive. So now I've got a list of numbers, and I want to list them and repeat them, print them out. So I can say I'm going to use these as a unordered list, right? li or any one of these can be attached to something called an ng-repeat tag, like a for, like for each. And has its own little syntax. Number in numbers. And then inside there I can say number. Oh, and by the way, I can say, for example, what's the index? See that on the right there? So ng-repeat, another directive, that one iterates through a collection and outputs the tag it's attached to for each one. So ng-repeat, and then the expression is something in list of things. And they have little things like index, even, odd. So if you want to do CSS rules, you could do those. Even, odd, first, last, index starting from 0, little things. And each of these ng-repeats creates a scope. So it has really clean breath. No, sorry. But one thing I'll show you is I wanted to bring up something that you have access to in Angular. It's a plugin called the Angularjs Batarang, and this is a Chrome plugin. It was written by a guy named Brian Ford, who spoke last year at ETE. He was one of the guys doing the Angular Directives talk. And so he was actually a college student at the time, so he's my hero officially. And because I wish I was as smart as he is. But anyway, so what this does is it lets you inspect and take a look at data within Angular objects. Let's see if this works for me. Scope. Of course, it won't show. It's a great demo, isn't it? It's riveting. I think the reason is CodePen is probably really like messing with us here. This may even be an iframe that it's running under, who knows. But if I were to look at this in a regular Angular app or download this app, you would see the outer scope, you would see the scope with message in it, and it literally would show the data. And then for each of the repeats, you'd see a separate internal scope with the index first, last, and the value for each of the numbers. So, but if that is working, it looks like it doesn't work with CodePen. I've had it work with Plunker before, just FYI. So it looks like CodePen has a problem with it, or maybe I did something wrong. Very possible. But that's the tool. It's called Angularjs Batarang. And it will even do things like, you know, when this thing is running, and maybe I'll do it for the Plunker ones, it'll show you how much time it takes to do various things. So if you're doing a lot of work in one area, it will bubble up to the top in terms of the amount of time it's taking CPU-wise. It's a really useful little tool, even though it doesn't work right now. Okay. Now, what about conditionals? So yes, you do have the ability, and you start looking at this and saying, do I really want to write so much code in the HTML? I get that. But let's say you have something you need to show only if some condition is true. Right? Well, you can either show and hide, and they do have that. For example, you can say, and I'm just going to type this in and show you syntax-wise what it looks like, ng show, and then some sort of expression like, you know, customer nil something. And this isn't going to work, but you get the idea of I can put some sort of expectation in there, some sort of condition inside that ng show. There's also an ng hide, ng enable, ng disable, that kind of stuff. But the thing is about all those, it's all CSS tricks. So it will still put this stuff in the DOM, and for show and hide, it will either make it visible or not visible. The one performance tip I'll give you today to start you off thinking about these things is ngIf. ngIf, if it's true, puts it in the DOM, and if it's not true, rips it out of the DOM, or never put it in the first place. So let's say you have, for example, a section that only shows up when you click on advanced, and it has a lot of data points in your user interface. You don't want to go through that pain unless you want to click on that checkbox. Well, then you want to use ngIf for that section. Only if that Boolean is true, add the contents to the DOM. Don't take the hit and make it invisible. So that's the kind of thing you can do. So there's an ngIf, and ngIf would take an expression, you know, like here, ngIf, and then you could basically have it hide or show something. So I didn't want to get into the syntax, and there's a little bit of variation, but if you go to the Angular site, and let me show you that, angularjs.org, one thing they try to do, and their documentation has been getting better over time, and they try where they can to show you little tiny snippets of code for everything that they're discussing. So for example, if I go into ng show, they should give me a sample here. Yeah, there we go, examples. Right, they're using some animations, and they're showing show and hide. And you can take their code, and that's where I found Plunker from. They do all these in Plunker. So that's another JavaScript editing tool. So in their documentation on all the things they build, they try where they can to give you live demos to play with, so you can get a feel for how the syntax works. And that is in the angularjs.org site under develop API reference, for example. So the next concept, I have to watch my time. The next concept is routing. And routing, I have another example. If you go back to that Chariot page there, chariotsolutions.com, Angular ETE. You can go to that second one, CodePen page part 2, if you'd like to follow along. And this one I start using the router. And I wanted to show you this because it's one of the Angular features that requires an external module. Might as well look at one of those now and see why that array exists on the right when you do an angular.module. So the visual effect is whenever I click on these two links here, I'm switching views. This is super exciting. But what you'll notice, actually you can't see it here because it looks like they hide this with an iframe, but if you were using this in a regular browser, you'd see /pound, or at the end of that you'd see #1, /2. And it would be changing the history portion of the URL at the very end. That's what you would see. So what it's doing with routing, with the I shouldn't say built-in, with the Angular supply router, is it's going and modifying the history portion of the URL. And when that gets modified, it notifies the router. It's watching that field, watching for a history change, sees the new change and goes through some routing rules and says, what view should I show? So let me walk through how that works. First thing is you have to add a script for it. So one of my scripts here is the Angularjs script. The router is a separate script file, angular-route. Still part of the same project, but they modularized it in Angular 1.2. So it's a separate file. So you mount that second after your Angular basics. And then somewhere on the page, you determine where the views live. And what we use is something called ng-view. It's another directive. So ng-view is where it places our views when it routes. Hence this little section here inside the Jumbotron. That's the big square or rectangle in Bootstrap, CSS. So now, all I have to do is tell the configuration, tell the app to use routing, turn on that feature, and define the rules for my routing. So the first step I already did. The first step was tell Angular in the module here, use ng-route as a dependency. So I'm importing another module. That's all I'm doing. Then I'm going to call a method. So once I've created my module, I'm only using one script, so I'm doing it all in one line. Create the module, now run the config function. And the config function runs before it starts executing the application. It's a lifecycle method on Angular, and they basically use it for setting up any settings you might have for your various components. One of the components that can be set up is a route provider. The route provider is the thing that does the routing. Okay, it's your implementation of the routing. And so you'll see I'm injecting that. The config takes a function, goes all the way down to here. That's it right there. And that function I'm injecting with route provider. The route provider tells it what to do when it hits different history states. So we don't care about whether it used the pound sign or not. We don't care how it got the route, but the path will be after that /1, /2. So when we hit /1 in our history, show a file, show a template called template1.html, which can be a separate file. Right? Load that file up. And that file, just like the one we had in index.html, can have directives in it. It can mount controllers like we're doing. So templates will do whatever you can do in a regular view, you can do in a template. Haven't shown this, but you can put controller : in here and put a name of a controller, and it will run that controller to set up that view. So we have two routes, 1 and 2. And then we have an otherwise. And so the syntax is we're doing $routeprovider.when, and the when function returns the route provider so I can call it again. .when, it's that Fluent API kind of configuration. When returns it again, and then we do the otherwise. If we don't get a valid route, throw it back to 1. Make sure you pick a real valid route, or it'll go through about 10 times and give up, right? But that's all you have to do. So if I want to do something for that route, let's do something for a route here. Controller, one controller, function, scope. And we'll go back to our router here, and we'll say for one controller, comma, if I can use the comma key. And in that one, I can say the scope message is, and it doesn't matter if it's called message, it could be anything. Equals I am controller one. Now, the way I did the templates in this tool, there's two ways you do templating. You could mount scripts of a type, text/ng template. Most people don't do that. But turns out that I was 3/4 of the way through my demo this morning, went, oh, it doesn't support external files. So if your web server supports different files, you just put them in there as different files and put the path to them. It works just fine. But because I didn't have this with this tool, with CodePen, I just said, okay, fine, how do you do it with scripts? And when it sees a script with an ID, it makes that available as an HTML template, and it uses the Angular template syntax to run the expressions. So I can say message. Okay, so that did work. And I can do the same thing for this one if I want to. So how are we doing so far with Angular, just in terms of the very basics? I'm going very fast, I know. But in terms of the basics, we have to create an app, a module. Call it an app, call it a module, whatever you want. You can use brackets at the second parameter. If there's no dependencies, you just use a simple empty array. If you do have dependencies, you put those in. And then you define things like controllers. A controller runs and sets up your view. You can set up routing, and routing can run controllers and set up and show a view. And then you start wiring different things together. And again, the key thing here is the scope. The scope is extremely important. So that covers the basics. So here's an example of using, just kind of running through these again. Here's an example of using a module with two dependencies. We're importing the router, and we're also importing a UI component layer. There's a nice project called UI Bootstrap from the Angular UI team, and it's a bunch of Angular directives for things like alerts and tab folders and things like that from the Bootstrap project. For every Bootstrap feature, they have an Angular attribute-based directive or tag-based directive. So if you look, you can take a look at what the Bootstrap project is and learn a lot about it and how to use it. There's also a website, ngmodules.org. And ngmodules.org, the first one they have, the most popular is Angular UI, and that's the Bootstrap project. Or I should say the Angular UI is the collection of all of their projects, but there's a suite of projects in this thing somewhere. And then the Bootstrap project underneath it from Angular UI are all the Angular directives, which looks like they've changed their documentation, so much for the demo. But they have a GitHub project. There it is, a GitHub project for it, and a website for it as well. And in the website, they go through how to use these directives. I'll give you a quick example of the alerts. So alerts aren't part of AngularJS. Right, so here are the silly little alert examples. These are Twitter Bootstrap. But if you mount the Angular UI script and you install Bootstrap CSS, and you use that Angular.module UI Bootstrap, you can mount these alerts. So here's the JavaScript. Right, they're setting up these little alert objects. And then on the page, here's a tag-based directive. It's an alert tag. So you can define tags as directives, or attributes, or even styles can activate directives. But the idea is this alert tag triggers an Angular directive, a piece of software that says, oh, if I see alert, Then I'm going to load this HTML template and replace this tag with that template, or at least add the template to the tag. And for this, we're using ngRepeat. So we're not just going to do one alert. We're going to walk through every single alert we have. And for each one, we're going to generate that alert directive and run it. Then you can see you can feed it things like a type and a little close function. Like when I click on the little X box, what do I run? How do I close it? And so that's just one of their directives. If you were curious, you go over to GitHub, you could take a look at the alert directory in Bootstrap. This is roughly the type of code that is a directive. And I will say now, of all the things to learn in Angular, it's only 1/6 or 7th of the components, but it's probably 50% of your sophistication in Angular, to be honest. Because it's all around DOM manipulation, right? If you're really good at jQuery and jQuery UI, you have to change your thinking to deal with Angular's directives, but you can do the same kinds of things. You just have to kind of fit into their world. If you've never done that kind of stuff, it could be a little daunting. So I'll say that's probably where the hardest sophistication in Angular is, but it's got the most reward. And so, for example, here's an alert directive, right? Directive alert, so that's the name of the thing. Restrict EA says it's either a tag or an attribute. So E is an element tag, A is an attribute. So you can use alert as a tag or an attribute. The template that they use to render the alert, the HTML for it, is in the GitHub project is template/alert/alert HTML. And you'll see it basically is Bootstrap code. It's HTML Bootstrap with a little bit of Angular directives mixed in to pull things in from your data that you passed it. And it takes 2 parameters. This is a little cryptic, but the type it takes is a string, read-only string. And close is whatever I pass it as a function, run that function when I click on close. So I'm not even going into the syntax of this too deeply because it's a lot more than what I can do in 45 minutes. But these are the types of code that you can write for the UI side of things. But let me bring it back to earth for you a little bit, and we'll talk about code you can write from the business side of things. Because that's not hard. So I'm going to go back to that code pen here, and I'm going to build a simple service. A service is basically a single object that you can pass in and dependency inject, just like the Angular things. All the Angular stuff with $signs like scope, and there's other ones like log and other things as well. They're all services. So I'm going to find a service. Service. And I'm going to call this message service. Whoops. I have to learn how to type first. I have to 1/4 of, right? Just to make sure. Yeah, 1/4 of. So we have 15 minutes. This is good. Now, in my message service, I'm going to inject another Angular service called $log. So what the heck is $log, you ask? I'm not going, no, I'm kidding. I'm not going to tell you. No, $log is one of their built-in services, basically wraps the console object. So it's the same as doing a console.log. And they have methods like, error and debug and info. Now, the first thing you might say is, well, why do I care? I can just do console.log, right? The reason you care is because they have another library for testing that replaces the regular log service with one that logs to an array buffer that you can then check when you run your test. Did I write to the log or not? It's really handy. So it writes to an array of strings in types like log, debug, error, trace, warn. So if you're trying to do something complex, you have to get certain messages in a certain sequence, but it only fails every once in a while. We could write a big loop and say, run this 1,000 times, and every time check to see the logs are just so, and then clear the logs. So that's one of the reasons you use their service instead of just console.log. So we're going to do something silly. We're just going to say in here, log.debug, message for you, sir. And then the guy gets the arrow in the back. Log. I'm sorry, never mind. Return. I'm jumping the gun. This needs to be in a function in the service. So let's talk about that. So service is an object. The object needs functions in it. It needs things that are functions. So I'm going to say log message, and that is a function that takes a message. And that. Jumping the gun. Sorry, everybody. And then this goes here. Message. There we go. So in my service definition, I'm returning, and actually I'd rather use, there's something called factory, which is I think better to use. Factory says, you give me the object to use, and my factory will create an instance of that object for you and call it message service. So let's pay attention to that syntax for a couple seconds. We're creating an object using a factory called message service. It is going to be created by this function call here. That creates it. We're dependency injecting logs so we can use the log service from Angular. To set it up, we're returning an object that will contain the function that we want to use. And so that object will have a log message on it. Therefore, message service, when I inject it, has a log message. And I can just say message server.log message and whatever I want in my string. So scope.log message equals, and I've got to dependency inject this. No $. There you go. So I define a log message service in my scope. Now I can click a button, have an input field with a model of MSG, or whatever I do here. I can pass that in. I'll do this in a second. I can pass that into the message service, into the log message function, and have it log to the log service. So scope.log message in my controller 1CTRL can log using the message service we just defined. Now, you might be looking at this funny. I see some looks. Like, how come I can define one below the other? Well, you can say the same thing about Spring. How can I define a Spring bean here and one here, and the bottom one depends on the first one? That makes sense. But the top one depends on the bottom one for some reason instead. It doesn't care. It reads all these method calls, and it figures out the right order to create things. That's part of the dependency injection system. It's just got to kind of take a look at all the config you want and then methodically go through and set everything up when it needs to do it. Let me wire this into the view. So we've got our log message. I'm going to go ahead and in the view here. This is for the template for don't you dare. The hand can be used like a knife. All right, so here we go. So template 1. So we've got our input ng model equals, our message. We'll get rid of this here. And then we'll do a button right after it. Button ng click equals, what was it, log message? I already forget. Log message. We'll just go with it. Log message. And then I can pass the parameter in if I want to. I'm sorry, that's not a, there we go. One parenthesis. And log message. Well, now you're nitpicking. You are correct. It's not a baton. Oh, there's many jokes I could use there. All right, come on. Yeah, this code pen updates every time you make a change. There it is. And if we were lucky at all, I missed the semicolon. I love pair programming. This was where? I think I just hit enter one time too many. So you don't need a semicolon inside of this because this is a property list. That should work. And I was more curious that I get a message in here. Message for you, sir. So there it is. In between all the complaints for using CodePen in the first place in Chrome, which apparently it doesn't like, security, origin, cross-site scripting stuff, it did actually print out the message. So we actually are using a service now. And so your services generally go out to things like databases through RESTful calls, interact with various types of services on the web. You might have push and pull. You might use socket.io and deliver messages through services. There's a bunch of things you can do with a service object. And that really is kind of the set of components you'll be working with. So the scope is the thing that the views bind to. Controllers set up the scope. And you can inject services into the controllers. So that's where your business logic and your data access logic is in the service. On the web side of things, on the HTML side, anything you used to do in jQuery, for example, gets done with a directive. Directives also can have injected services. So you might have a directive that has a button bar on it, let's say. And as you click on different buttons, you might be calling different service methods to do things to a model. So don't forget that this service concept, they can be used by controllers, but we can also use them inside of directives to communicate with our model as we manipulate the user interface. And that's kind of the whole big picture. Services are business logic, directives are UI logic, controllers set up views, and views are what you interact with as a user. And that's basically AngularJS. Now we have a little more time left. What I thought I would do is just give you 2 quick or 3 quick examples of directives that work that I wrote myself. I can kind of show you some interaction with directives. And then if we have a few minutes, take time for questions. So let me go with the directives and we'll see how lucky I get. So the first thing I have in here is I have a directive that has bi-directional bindings of data scope. So visually speaking, I'll explain. This thing here, all the highlighted stuff from customer on down, I clearly do not know how to design UI. But this is all inside of a template of a directive. It's called customer. Right? So I have a tag called customer, and that's emitting this junk here. On the outside, I have a model, and the model is called customer, and I have 2 input boxes that have first and last name. Right? So this is customer first name, customer last name. And when I change them, blah, 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 I'm changing the model, and I'm taking advantage of a feature called bi-directional data binding, and any parameter I passed to the directive is bi-directionally data bound. So whatever I change in the outside changes the directive, and anything in the directive changes the outside. Now, normally you wouldn't put it in both places, right? But for example, this is good for building your own complex components, right? You might have some sort of date picker. And you might pass a date picker, a JavaScript object with month, day, and year, right? And then it would bind to different up and down fields or whatever you want to do. And then as you're changing them, you're changing the data in the real scope in the outside. That's one of the reasons for using equals. So the code for that looks like this. Pardon my terrible sense of humor. So I've got an Angular directive in here. We'll look at the controller for the moment. It's a tag-based directive. It uses a template called customer.html. And it says that if there's a property called customer, another attribute on the customer tag called cust, take whatever the model name is in it and bi-directionally data bind it. So basically the way it works in JavaScript, it's a reference. It's a JavaScript reference, which means the thing inside is the thing outside. Here's my customer page. So this is the directives template. Let me just pull back a little. So I have my cheesy little table here with the first and last, and I'm holding on to the variable calling it my cust. In fact, if you look back at that script, on the left, what do I call it in the directive? What does it come from in the outside? In the directive, I call it my cust. This is called isolating my scope. So if you go search for Angular and you look up isolation of scope, you'll find it's in the directive section, and it's that thick. And it's got all sorts of good information about how to do this. So because I have the page itself mounting this thing as customer, there's my directive, cust equals, there's the property on the outside, there's my model object. And if we go back to the script, I define the model in the controller for the outer page, right? So I've got a main controller. I define customer as first and last name of Rob and Banks. And then in my page, I refer to that variable, pass it into the directive, which then renders it as my cust in its template. Two-way bidirectional data binding. Next example, this one is using unidirectional binding. What this means is I can define a variable to read from, and also, by the way, to update if it changes in the outside. But I'm not going to change it on the inside. It's read-only to me. I don't care about changing it. It's not something I'm going to manipulate in the directive. So the directive can be updated when it changes, perhaps, but it's not going to change it itself. So what it does is you can use the @ syntax instead of the equal syntax, and it will just take the string value and make it a string inside the directive. It's great for things like properties. You know, if you're doing a jQuery UI widget wrapper, you know, you want to wrap a date picker, and you want to pass in settings you might update on the outside. You're never going to update in the date picker itself, but you might change a property on the fly, right? Weekends are out because I checked the box on the outside. Whatever. Point being that the outside can change and notify the inside, but the inside will never change the outside. And that's this code. So the effect looks like this. Right? Inner data, nothing on the outside could care. Notice that nothing changed on the outside when I change the inside. Right? This one doesn't change. But when I change the outside, yep, it will change the inside. Maybe. I'll show you how we set it up and why it does what it does. All right? Script is very similar, except instead of one variable, now we have two. They're strings. So I have scope, first name on my inside in the directive, comes from an attribute @first name. @ means read-only. By the way, the capitals are significant. I'll show you the mounting of the directive. It basically takes capitals, makes them dashes and lower cases. So first name and last name. In my customer template, I now have a first name and a last name, and an input field for first and last name. And I could care less what I do with that. I could certainly change the values of those in my inner scope, but it's not bi-directionally updated. So anything I do locally is purely local to my directive. On the outside world, I use customer, and now I'm using an Angular expression in here because it wants a string, and I do have to put the braces in because I'm putting an expression in to evaluate a thing into a string. So there's a little bit of, like, you'll learn the syntax over time, but this example is, well, I've got to put a string in. By default, if I just type something in, it's a pure literal string. To get it to do Angular for a string, I've got to tell it to run an Angular expression. And that's why it's in braces. So first name is from customer.firstname, last name is from customer.lastname. If I type them in manually, they would never update from the outside because there's no changes that could make them change. But because I make an expression there, bidirectional. I have one more thing. Here's a directive that, you know, you have this two-way data binding concept. So, you know, nothing is changing the outside until I tell it to. Now that's a little more powerful, right? I can say, when I'm ready, call this function on the outside and pass it data. So you can do that too with directives. And I'm only scratching the surface, but I'm giving you an idea of some of the things you can do. And in that one, we use the and sign, the and sign. So that looks like this. So yes, it's a element. In the scope, I'm going to define something called save in my code in the directive. That's a function on my scope in the directive. It will be bound to whatever I pass the parameter save in the outside. Remember earlier I did ng-click equals and I gave it a function name? This is me doing the same thing. I'm defining an outlet, a way to call something. So I know that in my directive I have something called save, and whatever it is will get called when I trigger that function. So I'll jump over the mount of the directive, and there it is right here, customer save equals save customer first last. On the directive side of things, I have a button in the directive with an ng click that calls my outside thing called save. So, thank you. No, so that's, and there is a way to pass one parameter into, from the inside to the outer parameter. So those things, as you're starting to hack around with Angular, they'll be on the reference page in about a half hour. I'll make sure those different plunkers are available for you to steal. Feel free to steal them as you're learning. So that gives you a few of the use cases for the directive side of things so you can start playing around. And I'll give you another one which does some jQuery integration as well. There's a function in directives, for example, called link, right? And it has scope and element and attributes. And the element that it gives you is a jQuery element. So anything you've done, like with, jQuery.click or tab set or whatever for jQuery UI, by default it gives you this light version of jQuery, like 26 different functions, right? But if you mount jQuery before you mount Angular, you get the full jQuery. Bottom line is, that is a jQuery element. So it's like you did the search in jQuery and you got your node back. That's your node. So anything you're used to doing with jQuery, you have to learn that instead of looking for it manually in code, you attach something to an element using a directive, an attribute on something, and then you get that element back and you can code a link function, which is the equivalent of, okay, I've looked it up, here it is. And here are all its attributes. And here's the scope that I can put data into for the template of this directive. Now, I know a lot of that is probably way over your heads if you're not used to Angular at all. Some of you might connect to it, some might not. But I'm planting the seeds here when you do your experimenting so you can start looking at these things and it might trigger, oh yeah, that's the way this works. Okay, so I know we're going to be up against a time constraint here. Are there any quick questions? And if there's anything more significant, we can take it out in the hall. But anything real quick? Okay. Yes. Sure.
Real naive question. You haven't shown us anything that's actually happening on server side here, right?
That is correct.
So you need to have some JSON or something in there.
Yeah, the area I did because 45 minutes, right?
I understand.
But there's a thing you can throw in called HTTP, for example. So the HTTP object has a get, a put, a post, a delete, right? Look in that object. And then also there's one called $resource if you have like a RESTful server with, you want to do CRUD type calls. So there's $resource as well. But look at $HTTP. It'll be all over the documentation. And the thing that there's no way I don't have time to cover it here, but you'll learn, is promises, which is you're never going to get anything back synchronously from this stuff because it goes to the web and it sends an event. So like the HTTP.get method has like a success and error function. And that's one way you can do it. Like, okay, if it worked, update the DOM or model. But there's also a promise that it gets back. So there's a whole thing around promises in Angular, which is the big, like, how do I deal with things asynchronously?
Cool, thanks.
Sure, you're welcome. Anybody else? Okay, thank you for coming.